In the early centuries of the Christian era, before powerful empires took hold of the emerging faith, spirituality was a vibrant landscape filled with diverse ideas, experiences, and visions of the divine. Within primitive communities, particularly among the followers of Jesus, belief was expressed through oral stories, meditative practices, symbolic teachings, and a profound sense of spiritual communion. There was no single dogmatic truth imposed. Instead, there existed a living tapestry of interpretations, allowing each individual to experience the sacred in their own unique way. This deeply organic and decentralized environment posed a threat to power structures that would soon recognize the risks associated with such freedom. As the teachings spread across different regions of the Roman Empire, Christianity began to absorb a diverse array of cultural, philosophical, and religious influences. This led to a rich tapestry of beliefs, some with mystical perspectives, others with philosophical interpretations, and still others viewing Jesus as a symbol of internal transformation rather than a literal figure to be worshipped. However, the diversity flourishing among these communities was perceived by many as a dangerous disorder. The fear of doctrinal chaos fueled the demand for a framework that would define what was true and what should be dismissed as error. It was in this context that the concept of orthodoxy emerged, along with its inevitable counterpart, heresy. The term heresy originally didn't carry the negative connotation it does today. Derived from the Greek word heresis, it simply meant choice or school of thought. To be heretical was merely a way of choosing to interpret faith differently. However, the transformation of this word into a deadly accusation marks one of the most tragic chapters in humanity's spiritual history. What began as spiritual freedom of choice gradually morphed into a crime, punishable by social exclusion, persecution, and ultimately, death. Thus, not only was dogma born, but so were its guardians, the future enforcers of official truth. As Christianity began to take hold, especially after Emperor Constantine's conversion, a profound transformation occurred. The faith that had once been practiced in the shadows, underground, in deserts, and in catacombs, was now drawn to the allure of imperial power. As a result, the faith lost its simple purity and donned golden robes, becoming a political tool. The persecution that Christians had once endured would, paradoxically, be inflicted by them, all in the name of protecting the revealed truth. What was at stake was no longer spiritual purity, but the preservation of a structure that needed to control beliefs in order to solidify its dominance. It's crucial to understand that the establishment of a standard of faith did not arise from a unified divine revelation, but rather from heated disputes among groups with differing viewpoints, often driven more by political agendas than spiritual concerns. Gnostics, for instance, believed that spiritual knowledge was an internal and personal journey, directly connecting the soul to the divine. For them, the true temple was within, and there was no need for intermediaries between humanity and the sacred. These liberating ideas posed a threat to the emerging authority of bishops and ecclesiastical leaders who sought to centralize spiritual power. The resistance to these mystical ideas stemmed not only from theological disagreements, but also from the realization that such thoughts undermined the foundation of an institution seeking power and control. By asserting that the divine resided within each individual rather than solely in ecclesiastical rituals or sanctioned texts, the Gnostics and other spiritual groups challenged the very need for a hierarchical structure. This threat was keenly felt and soon became a justification for branding these thinkers as heretics. What was at stake was not merely a difference of opinion, but the control over people's minds. Over time, ecclesiastical councils were organized with the aim of officially defining which beliefs would be deemed orthodox and which would be rejected as false. These gatherings, far from being a genuine quest for spiritual truth, operated more like political arenas where decisions were often made by majority vote rather than divine inspiration. Faith began to be legislated, and mystical experiences, once celebrated, were dismissed as deception, illusion, or spiritual rebellion. Heresy transformed from a fluid concept into a definitive mark of condemnation. This institutionalized construction of faith profoundly shaped the future of Western spirituality. The sacred gradually distanced itself from internal experience, transforming into a written doctrine that was monitored and enforced. The book took the place of contemplative silence. Hierarchy replaced brotherhood. The altar overshadowed individual conscience. Those who dared to question this new order were labeled as traitors, enemies of the truth, and inevitably, heretics. The seeds of fear were sown not in the hearts of the unbelievers, but in those of the faithful who now felt compelled to obey, not out of love, but out of obligation. It is precisely at this juncture that the feared figure of the Lord of Dogma emerges. Someone who stands as the ultimate authority on faith, not through spiritual enlightenment, but by institutional mandate. This Lord doesn't need to grasp the mysteries of the Spirit. He merely applies them according to established rules. Spirituality has come to be measured by obedience rather than the depth of experience. Salvation has been turned into a bargaining chip, and the divine has become a tool for control. In this way, a system is created that dictates what can or cannot be believed. This dogmatic mindset hasn't just silenced historical heretics. It has also stifled curiosity, contemplation, symbolic thinking, and spiritual boldness. It has prevented entire generations from exploring their own mysteries. It imposed a singular view of the cosmos, a definitive narrative of good and evil, and a rigid spiritual map. The fear of being labeled a heretic has silenced genuine questions and hindered personal exploration. Doubt, which has always been the starting point of wisdom, has come to be regarded as a sin. Meanwhile, true spirituality, the kind that arises from intimate and silent experience, retreated to the secret refuges of the human soul. A few brave souls dared to keep this sacred flame alive, hidden away, hunted, and invisible to the eyes of the system. They were the first martyrs of consciousness. They didn't perish merely for their dissent, but for their ability to see beyond the veil of convention. They were silenced, not for blasphemy, but for their courage. With them, an invisible lineage of seekers began to emerge, refusing to accept that truth could be owned. This is the foundation upon which future mechanisms of spiritual censorship would be built. By understanding how heresy was shaped, we realize it was never about error. It was always about power. The line that separated the believer from the rebel was drawn not by love for the divine, but by the fear of losing control. And so, in the silence of dungeons and the flames of pyres, the shadow of dogma was born, a force that still resonates within our structures, cloaked in tradition but rooted in repression. As time went on and Christianity spread across various regions of the ancient world, a quiet yet strategic transformation began to shape what would become the largest spiritual empire in Western history. Christianity, which started as a message of love, community, and inner liberation, began to intertwine with the mechanisms of political and state power. As this alliance solidified, particularly after the official endorsement by the Roman Empire, the concept of truth shifted from an inner quest to an institutional imposition. Faith ceased to be a personal journey and was transformed into a defined territory where crossing certain boundaries meant becoming an enemy of God himself. This marked the dawn of a new order, the empire of a singular truth. This empire was not just a framework of spiritual beliefs, it functioned as an organism of ideological control. It required stability, predictability, and uniformity. To achieve this, dissent had to be eradicated. What was once seen as a diversity of thought became a threat to the unity of the church and the peace of the empire. The narrative of error replaced that of personal experience, and punishment took the place of acceptance. Thus, there arose a need to monitor not just behaviors, but also minds. A person could be kneeling at the altar, but if their thoughts diverged from the official doctrine, that was enough for condemnation. With Constantine's rise to the throne of the Roman Empire and his conversion to Christianity, a previously marginalized religion gained significant power. The Edict of Milan in 313 AD legalized the Christian faith, ending centuries of persecution, but also ushering in a new kind of threat, the manipulation of faith for political ends. Gradually, the church became intertwined with the state, receiving privileges, protection, influence, and prestige. However, this union came at a steep price: the sacrifice of spiritual pluralism and the acceptance of an authoritarian model of truth. It became more advantageous to conform to orthodoxy than to remain true to one's conscience. What was once a mystical and liberating experience was reduced to a rigid doctrine. Over time, church leaders realized that the best way to solidify their newfound power was through dogma. Doctrines began to be established in councils convened under the supervision of emperors, and sacred texts were edited, reorganized, and canonized based on a mix of theological interest and political convenience. Writings deemed subversive, symbolic, or divergent were systematically excluded. Texts that spoke of inner light, gnosis, and direct union with the divine, without the need for intermediaries, were dismissed as threats. Thus, truth came to be defined not by an awakened heart, but by an imperial seal. This consolidation of dogma as an absolute truth had profound and lasting consequences. Spiritual freedom was gradually replaced by an imposing orthodoxy that allowed no room for nuance, metaphor, or questioning. The leaders of the new imperial church took on the role of exclusive interpreters of divine will. Truth was no longer something to be discovered by each soul on its journey, but a decree to be followed without hesitation. In this way, a system emerged that granted sacred power to blind obedience and condemned any form of inner exploration as blasphemy. The institutionalization of faith has drastically changed the nature of spiritual experience. What was once an organic, open journey filled with mysteries and revelations has been transformed into a rigid set of dogmas with clearly defined boundaries. These boundaries are fiercely defended not only by bishops and priests, but also by armies and courts. Christianity increasingly became an empire within an empire, with its own laws, codes, and an authority that transcended political borders. Salvation, which was once viewed as an intimate process of transformation, has come to be marketed as a reward for doctrinal submission. The dogma, therefore, was not just a religious creation, it was a political invention. It served the purpose of controlling the masses, maintaining order, and ensuring the perpetuation of a hierarchy that, at its core, was more interested in stability than in transcendence. Each theological formula, every anathema directed at dissenters, and every creed that was drafted were all cogs in this machinery of spiritual domination. The goal was no longer to awaken the divine within, but to shape the individual according to an external standard. Inner exploration was replaced by conformity, and the pursuit of wisdom gave way to blind obedience. Those who dared to think differently were labeled as heretics and cast out from the community of faith. Their ideas were condemned as poison, their writings burned, and their memories erased. Many were killed in the name of doctrinal purity. The early Christians persecuted by the empire were now replaced by Christian thinkers persecuted by the church itself. History took a cruel turn, and the very system that once condemned became the new executioner. Spiritual freedom was stifled, not by the unbelievers, but by those who claimed to be the defenders of the truth. And this truth, now crystallized, became not only indisputable, but also sacred in its rigidity. Symbolic thinking, mystical contemplation, and inner visions began to be viewed with suspicion. Mystery gave way to dogma, and doubt was demonized. It became essential to believe exactly as the leaders dictated. Otherwise, it was better not to believe at all. Thus, millions were led into a form of faith that was no longer a lived experience but a mere obligation. Under this burden, the human spirit became ill, forgetting that truth can never be caged. The creation of this singular truth also redefined the role of time. The past was reinterpreted according to the new orthodoxy, and the entire history of faith prior to its official recognition was retold through a different lens. Heroes were turned into enemies, inspirational writings became threats, and the martyrs of spiritual freedom were silenced. The present was governed by an imposed morality, while the future was promised only to the obedient. It was the construction of an all-encompassing narrative, aiming to dominate not just the body and mind, but the soul as well. What was most unsettling, however, was that this structure no longer required overt force to maintain its grip. Fear had already taken root in the hearts of the faithful. The fear of thinking, of questioning, of seeking for themselves. The dogma was now defended not only by the leaders, but also by the very victims of it. Repression became internalized. The empire of a singular truth solidified its throne not on stone altars, but within the imprisoned minds. It was the triumph of control over the light of awareness. In the silence that followed, many still heard the call of freedom. Inner whispers, flashes of ancient wisdom, echoes of a spirituality that refused to fade away. But the empire was relentless. Its gaze was everywhere. Its judgments were final. Its language was one of unquestionable certainty. And heresy had now become merely the reminder that another path exists. In the year 325 AD, in the city of Nicaea, by the shores of Lake Ascanius, an assembly was convened that would forever alter the course of spirituality in the Western world. Under the authority of Roman Emperor Constantine, around 300 bishops from various regions of the empire gathered, not to celebrate the diversity of faith, but to define, limit, and regulate it. This historic event, known as the First Council of Nicaea, marked the official birth of Christianity as a state religion and the beginning of a systematic effort to exclude, silence, and criminalize all dissenting voices within the Christian tradition. It was no longer merely a matter of spirituality. It had become a matter of belief engineering. What began there was not just a council, but a new form of power. The motivation behind the council was primarily political. Constantine, newly converted to Christianity and eager to unify his vast empire under a single faith, viewed the internal divisions within the church as a threat to stability. For the emperor, it didn't matter much which doctrine would prevail, as long as it could serve as the ideological glue for the empire. Theological disagreements were treated as state issues. In this way, spiritual diversity was seen as civil rebellion, and those who disagreed with the official narrative were branded not only as religious heretics, but also as enemies of public order. The cross and the sword began to walk hand in hand. At the heart of the disputes was the nature of Jesus Christ. Was he God incarnate or merely an enlightened prophet? Was he of the same substance as the Father or a created being? These questions, which belonged to the realm of mystery and contemplation, were thrust into the arena of decree and punishment. Bishop Arius, who championed the belief that Jesus was a divine creation but not equal to God the Father, became the emblem of the heresy to be fought against. His perspective, though deeply rooted in earlier spiritual traditions, was deemed unacceptable. The council declared that Jesus was of the same substance as the Father, a metaphysical assertion that would become the non-negotiable foundation of the imperial Christian creed. From that moment on, any thought that challenged this definition was automatically condemned. This decision wasn't born out of spiritual revelations, but rather from intense negotiations, political alliances, and pressure from the emperor. The truth was shaped not by the enlightenment of those present, but by the need for uniformity. What was at stake wasn't the discovery of divine essence, but the establishment of a system. The imposition of the Nicene Creed marked the first step towards creating a rigid orthodoxy, where all Christians were required to declare their faith according to a specific formula under the threat of excommunication. Faith became something recited with the lips, even if the heart cried out something entirely different. The Council of Nicaea also set dangerous precedents. The first heresy officially condemned by the imperial church was not merely a doctrinal disagreement. It was deemed a crime punishable by exile, censorship, and the destruction of writings. From that point on, it was no longer enough to refute the ideas of dissenters. It became essential to erase them from history. The texts associated with Arius were burned, his followers were persecuted, and his ideas were labeled as dangerous. The goal was not just to win the debate, but to eradicate any possibility of alternative interpretations gaining traction. This marked the beginning of a long tradition of intellectual annihilation as a means of maintaining spiritual power. The gravity of what was established in Nicaea cannot be underestimated. For the first time, spiritual truth was subjected to the authority of a state council. Even worse, this truth began to be enforced by force. The essence of faith transformed from an intimate experience into something determined by majority vote. Instead of deepening the understanding of the mystery, the imperial church chose to reduce it to an unchangeable formula. In doing so, it set in motion a logic of exclusion. Anything that fell outside the Nicene mold would be labeled as error, and anything that did not conform to the new creed would be dismissed as deception. This process didn't end at Nicaea. On the contrary, the council became a model for various other gatherings in the centuries that followed. At each new council, new dogmas were established, new heresies were declared, and additional layers of spiritual control were introduced. What began as an effort towards unification quickly morphed into a machine for producing singular truths. Each decision made not only shaped the present of the church, but also rewrote the past, erasing figures and ideas that once enriched the Christian tradition. Thus, the history of faith became a selective narrative, where the victors reconfigured the facts to serve their interests. The engineering of belief established at Nicaea had profound implications for the social structure of the empire. The imposition of a single religious truth served as a model for controlling other aspects of life. The state and the church merged in their strategies of domination, using fear as their primary tool. The faithful were not just encouraged to believe, they were coerced into it. The space for mystery, metaphor, and inner reflection was gradually crushed by the demand for conformity. Salvation came to be assured, not by the sincerity of one's heart, but by outward adherence to a specific set of beliefs. Meanwhile, many thinkers, mystics, and seekers continued to quietly nurture the traditions that had been condemned. These men and women understood that the divine cannot be confined to formulas. They recognized that the Spirit moves where it wills, and that the experience of the sacred cannot be legislated. However, they also knew that expressing these truths openly was fraught with danger. In many instances, they paid the price with exile, torture, or even their lives. They were erased from the records, but their ideas, like hidden embers, continued to smolder beneath the ashes of dogma. What was lost at Nicaea was more than just theological freedom. It was the very spirit of inquiry. Spirituality was subdued by an authoritarian structure that, despite claiming to be guided by faith, operated like any system of power, through control, censorship, and the elimination of dissent. The council did not unify the church, it institutionalized division. It drew a line between the saved and the lost, the faithful and the wayward, the orthodox and the heretics. This was a deep cut into the soul of the Christian tradition, a wound that would resonate for centuries, shaping persecutions, religious wars, and inquisitions. What's most concerning is how this mindset continues to operate behind the scenes of modern spirituality. The Nicene mentality persists whenever someone believes that only one way of thinking is valid, that only one interpretation is acceptable, and that questioning is a deviation. The shadow of the council looms over all institutionalized religions that have replaced mystery with doctrine. Whenever a seeker is silenced by doubt or an idea is dismissed for not fitting the mold, the legacy of Nicaea is evident. Contrary to popular belief, dogma doesn't just belong to the past, it reinvents itself in the present. Nicaea was not just a singular event, it marked the beginning of an era where faith was quantified through formulas, doubt was criminalized, and the sacred was confined to decrees. Although the names may have changed today, the underlying logic remains the same: control to protect, exclusion to maintain order, definition to restrict freedom. Yet, the human spirit, even when wounded, has never ceased its quest for a truth that transcends words. For this reason, the history of that council must still be remembered, not to repeat its mistakes, but to ensure we never forget the cost of silencing the soul. Beneath the polished surface of orthodoxy lies a vast and forgotten spiritual library, a collection of texts that have been deliberately silenced, banned, and erased from the official versions of faith. Many of these writings, now categorized as apocryphal gospels or Gnostic manuscripts, present a profoundly different picture of early Christianity. They not only offer alternative interpretations of the figure of Jesus, but also challenge the monopoly on truth established by ecclesiastical councils and sanctioned by imperial power. These fragments represent a spirituality that refused to bow to decrees, viewing the divine not as an external lord, but as an inner presence accessible to all, which is precisely why they were deemed too dangerous to survive. The rediscovery of these texts, particularly with the finding of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts in 1945 in the Egyptian desert, offered the modern world a glimpse into what had been so meticulously erased. Among them were preserved Gospels, such as those of Thomas, Mary Magdalene, Philip, and the Apocryphon of John, texts that present a deeply symbolic, mystical, and introspective view of the spiritual journey. Rather than depicting an institutional Christ, these Gospels reveal a master who directs us inward, inviting individuals to transcend the material world and immerse themselves in the direct knowledge of the divine light that resides within each person. The focus shifts from sin and punishment to awakening and remembering one's true essence. This type of teaching stood in stark contrast to the dogmatic logic that was beginning to take hold of the Church. The Christ portrayed in these texts does not demand blind worship, but encourages the cultivation of awareness. He does not establish churches, but ignites hearts. He does not impose creeds, but invites silence. This approach was seen as subversive by the guardians of dogma because it required no structures, no mediators, and did not support ecclesiastical authority. Instead, it challenged it. It represented spirituality in its purest form, free from bureaucracy, detached from imposed rituals, and rooted in direct experience with the divine. Throughout history, this has been regarded as heresy by those who seek to control. The Forbidden Gospels also unveil a more human, complex, and inclusive narrative about figures like Mary Magdalene. Often depicted in canonical versions as a redeemed sinner, these texts present her as an enlightened disciple, a bearer of spiritual wisdom, and possibly a central figure within Jesus' inner circle. The male-dominated structure of religion prevented a woman from taking on a prominent spiritual role, leading to her diminished portrayal. This diminishment was not merely symbolic, it was strategic. By silencing female voices and alternative perspectives, the new Christianity reinforced its authority as patriarchal, hierarchical, and exclusive. The exclusion of apocryphal texts also meant the exclusion of sensitivities, nuances, and the potential for integrating reason with intuition, the masculine with the feminine, and the divine with the human. The violence against these texts wasn't limited to the realm of ideas. It was literal, brutal, and systematic. Entire codices were burned, libraries were destroyed, scribes were hunted down, and masters were silenced. In the name of doctrinal purity, centuries of spiritual richness were erased. What remained was a diminished narrative, simplified and molded to fit the empire and the ecclesiastical institution. Diversity was stifled by decrees, and deep symbolism was replaced by superficial literalism. The mystery faded under the weight of censorship. Yet despite all efforts to suppress them, the spirit of these texts has never died. They survived hidden in caves, buried in clay pots, preserved by anonymous hands that understood they were safeguarding more than just pages. They were protecting the memory of a Christianity that dared to be free. Gnosis, which is prominently featured in these writings, proposes something that still challenges power structures today: a direct and intransferable knowledge of spiritual reality. The term gnosis does not refer to the accumulation of information, but rather to an intimate and transformative perception of the truth that resides at the core of one's being. This wisdom cannot be taught. It can only be awakened. This is precisely why gnosis is seen as a threat by hierarchical systems, because it removes the need for external control. An awakened individual doesn't need walls, doesn't bow to dogmas, doesn't fear doubt, and doesn't compromise their light. Gnosis represents the ultimate threat to the empire of a singular truth, as it reveals that every human being carries within them both the temple and the altar. The exclusion of Gnostic Gospels and other texts deemed heretical was not merely a theological containment effort. It was an attempt to shape collective consciousness. By determining which texts could be read, which stories would be told, and which interpretations would be accepted, the guardians of dogma took on the role of censors of the human soul. They established not only a church, but also an all-encompassing narrative, where anything that deviated from the norm was swiftly labeled as deception. As a result, they created generations of believers who, despite their sincere faith, were never granted access to the full richness of the spiritual traditions that came before them. The burning of these texts and the persecution of their guardians reveal an uncomfortable truth. The fear of free thought has always outweighed the desire for genuine enlightenment. Those who shaped institutional Christianity understood that allowing multiple interpretations of faith would open the door to an uncontrollable spirituality. And the empire needed control. That's why inner knowledge was buried under layers of dogma. That's why symbols were reduced to literalism. That's why alternative spiritual maps were suppressed, not because they were false, but because they were too free. What endures as the legacy of these Gospels is the reminder that there have always been parallel paths, silenced voices, and untold truths. They remind us that spirituality was never meant to be a tool for power, but rather a call to freedom. Even today, they invite us to look beyond the confines of orthodoxy and to reclaim the vibrant spirit that beats behind the words. These texts do not demand blind faith. Instead, they require the courage to dive into the unknown, and this courage in itself is a heresy to those who thrive on repetition. Even after centuries of suppression, these forbidden texts continue to find their readers. Their words resonate like echoes of ancient wisdom, reminding us that truth belongs to no one and that the sacred cannot be tamed. When we read the Gospel of Thomas and come across phrases like, "The kingdom is within you and outside of you," we realize that such teachings could never thrive in a system that relied on mediation, structure, and control. With a single sentence, it dismantles the entire framework of dogma. That's why these texts were buried, not because they were wrong, but because they were dangerously true. The resurgence of these writings in the modern era is no mere historical coincidence. It emerges at a time when humanity is beginning to question old systems once again, seeking meaning beyond mere liturgical repetition and growing suspicious of authorities that claim to hold exclusive truths. In times of paradigm collapse, the rediscovery of forbidden gospels is a revolutionary act. They don't provide easy answers or promise instant salvation. Instead, they offer something far more valuable, an invitation to inner freedom. And once that invitation is heard, it cannot be ignored. For those who heed the call of Gnosis, even just once, will never be satisfied with manufactured dogmas. When the foundations of dogma were solidified through imperial decrees, theological councils, and the systematic suppression of spiritual diversity, one obstacle still remained to the complete consolidation of ecclesiastical power: the living thought that insisted on emerging from the margins, from caves, from fields, and from voices that refused to bend to the rigidity of established formulas. The human heart, no matter how pressured, continued to seek meaning, freedom, and authenticity. It was precisely this innate strength of the spirit that the masters of dogma feared most. To combat it, they needed to create a structure that went beyond mere rhetoric, something more efficient, more brutal, and more definitive. Thus, the machinery of the Inquisition was born, a theological apparatus that would turn fear into a tool of absolute control and transform faith itself into an instrument of psychological and social domination. The Inquisition didn't emerge suddenly. It was the culmination of centuries of ideological repression and persecution disguised as a quest for truth. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, the Catholic Church began to realize that doctrinal decrees were no longer sufficient to contain the movements that were growing beyond its control. Groups like the Cathars, Waldensians, Beguines, Mystics, alchemists, and many others were spreading ideas that revived a sense of original spiritual freedom, ideas that could not be ignored as they threatened to undermine the foundations of clerical authority. Unable to defeat those whose faith stemmed from direct experience through reasoned argument, the Church chose to conquer them through fear, a fear so profound that it would echo through generations and become ingrained in the collective unconscious of the West. It was under this rationale that the Inquisition was officially established. Initially, through the papal bull Ad Abolendam in 1184, which sanctioned the repression of heretics, and more systematically in the 13th century with the creation of inquisitorial tribunals by order of Pope Gregory IX. These tribunals were assigned to orders such as the Dominicans, whose members took on the role of inquisitors. With nearly unlimited powers, these individuals could interrogate, investigate, arrest, judge, and sentence anyone suspected of heresy, often merely for expressing a differing opinion, reading a forbidden book, or even remaining silent on religious matters. The mere suspicion was enough to ruin reputations, families, and lives. Contrary to popular belief, the Inquisition did not operate based on evidence or voluntary confessions. Instead, it relied on anonymous tips, rumors, twisted interpretations, and most importantly, confessions obtained through torture. Physical suffering was seen as a legitimate means to uncover the truth. Men and women were subjected to extreme cruelty, stretching, bone-crushing, simulated drownings, controlled burns, and various other forms of torment. The Inquisitors believed that pain could purify the soul and compel sinners to confess their wrongdoings. However, as we know, pain does not reveal truths, it only creates ghosts. This system of torture and fear operated not only as a punitive measure, but also as a pedagogical spectacle. The public would witness the autos da fe, public ceremonies where the condemned were humiliated, flogged, or executed, as a visual lesson on the fate that awaited those who dared to challenge the established order. It was a dramatization of obedience. The pyre, more than just a means to destroy the body, aimed to erase the example. Burning a heretic was also about extinguishing the seed of free thought that they represented. Fire became a symbol of eternal punishment, serving as a reminder to everyone that, according to the imposed narrative, God preferred submission over sincere inquiry. Among the primary targets of the Inquisition were not only theologians and dissenting thinkers, but also ordinary people, healers, midwives, naturalists, those who practiced ancestral spiritual traditions, or simply individuals who exhibited uncommon wisdom. Often, the accusations stemmed from neighbors driven by jealousy, resentment, or land disputes. The inquisitorial system not only institutionalized fear, but also fostered betrayal, mutual distrust, and the destruction of social fabric in the name of purity of faith. Spirituality once again became a tool of control, now manifesting in its most visceral and insidious form. The effectiveness of the Inquisition lay in its invisibility. It was impossible to know who was under investigation, who had made a denunciation, or who would be next. This lack of transparency was intentional. The more unpredictable it was, the more paralyzing the fear became. Dogma no longer required logic, it thrived on constant threat. Just thinking differently, or even being suspected of it, was enough to get caught in the inquisitorial machinery. Many chose silence over the risk of being misinterpreted. As a result, self-censorship became a second prison, deeper, more insidious, and far more effective. Over the centuries, the Inquisition spread across various regions of Europe, taking on different names and forms, yet always with the same aim: to stifle the human spirit in the name of a truth shaped by convenience and enforced through violence. Courts emerged in Spain, Portugal, France, and Italy, and their practices were later exported to the colonies, where they continued to operate under different guises. The Americas also experienced the horrors of the pyre, summary judgments, and the destruction of entire cultures deemed pagan or demonic. The terror of the Inquisition was not an isolated chapter, but a transcontinental mechanism for erasing spiritual diversity. The most tragic aspect is that, despite all this brutality, the Inquisition was justified as an act of love. Its defenders claimed they were saving souls from damnation, guiding the wayward back to the truth, and purifying the church of evil influences. The rhetoric of love became complicit in hatred. Faith was twisted into a justification for massacre, and the image of God, which should have inspired compassion, was instead linked to absolute fear. The inquisitorial machine represented the extreme manifestation of dogma taken to its limits, a structure that preferred death over doubt, silence over diversity, and pain over reflection. The effects of this era of terror didn't end with the formal dissolution of the inquisitorial courts. They continue to thrive in the subtle mechanisms of ideological control that still operate within religious, academic, and political institutions. The fear of being judged, the urge to conform, the reluctance to explore unconventional paths, these are all remnants of the collective trauma left by the Inquisition. Even without the presence of burning stakes, the repression of thought persists, now more sophisticated, more disguised, and more internalized. The modern inquisitor doesn't need to stand before us. They reside within, manifesting as a voice of self-judgment, stifling the courage to think freely. Understanding the Inquisition means grasping how far a dogmatic system will go to maintain its control. It reveals that heresy was never the real issue. The true threat has always been freedom. Thus, wherever there is inner freedom, there will also be attempts to stifle it. The legacy of those who were persecuted is not just one of suffering. It also serves as a reminder that the human spirit can endure, even in the harshest conditions. Somewhere there is always a flame that refuses to be extinguished, a word that slips through, a thought that insists on soaring despite the chains. As inquisitorial courts gained strength and the machinery of dogma advanced with relentless precision, a new type of enemy was identified and systematically pursued. Those who not only thought differently, but also lived outside imposed systems, revered nature, engaged with the unseen, honored the wisdom of the body, and listened to the quiet voice of the soul. These men and women posed not just a theological threat, but a challenge to the very power structure that upheld the existing order. They didn't seek permission to exist spiritually. They embodied freedom, and for that reason, they had to be silenced. Thus, the myths of witches and mystics emerged as representations of evil, when in reality, they were legitimate expressions of free spirituality resisting oppression. Behind the constructed image of witches as allies of the devil, there were wise women, healers, midwives, and those knowledgeable about lunar cycles, medicinal herbs, and ancestral rituals that connected them to the earth and the cosmos. They embodied a form of knowledge that was non-institutional, intuitive, and profound, passed down through experience, care, silent observation of nature, and listening to the soul. They were guardians of a wisdom that could not be codified in ecclesiastical manuals or confined within the rigid doctrines of orthodoxy. This autonomous and visceral knowledge posed a challenge to the monopoly of clerical wisdom. The power that radiated from these women was something that patriarchal theology could not comprehend, and thus it feared. It didn't take long for this wisdom to be linked to witchcraft and, consequently, to heresy. The Church, determined to eradicate anything beyond its control, crafted and perpetuated the image of the witch as a demonic figure, dangerous, seductive, and a challenge to Christian morals. This was a deliberate campaign of dehumanization, meticulously constructed to justify the systematic persecution of these women. Manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, published in the 15th century, served as guides for identifying, interrogating, judging, and eliminating witches. The result was a spiritual and physical genocide that spanned centuries, claiming the lives of hundreds of thousands of women across Europe. The terror didn't just target those who practiced rituals or engaged in natural healing. It extended to any woman who displayed independence, wisdom, spirituality outside the norm, or simply refused to conform to imposed behavioral standards. The image of the witch, shaped by institutional fear, served as a tool to suppress everything that was feminine, intuitive, sensual, free, and rebellious. It was also a means to erase humanity's matriarchal memory, which for millennia had honored the feminine principle as a vital aspect of the divine. The patriarchy and dogma conspired to bury this sacred heritage beneath the weight of moral condemnation and justified violence. But it wasn't just women who endured this brutal repression. Alongside them, many men were also targeted for embracing unconventional spiritual practices. Mystics, visionary monks, alchemists, poets, and philosophers who dared to speak of a direct experience with the sacred were similarly branded as heretics and cast into the flames. These individuals, often isolated, served as bridges between worlds, connecting the visible and the invisible, reason and intuition, the human and the eternal. They embodied what institutional religion feared most, the experience of the divine without intermediaries. As a result, they were ridiculed, persecuted, imprisoned, and their works were hidden or destroyed. Some of these mystics have become legends. Hildegard of Bingen, for instance, was a visionary who challenged the norms of her time with writings that intertwined spirituality, medicine, music, and cosmology. Meister Eckhart, a German theologian and mystic, spoke of the divine spark within every human being and faced condemnation for his subversive ideas. John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Marguerite Porete, and many others shone like beacons amidst the darkness of dogmatic control, often paying with their lives or enduring spiritual exile for daring to assert that God belongs to no one. Their writings have withstood the flames, and their words continue to resonate centuries later, serving as reminders that truth cannot be caged. The similarities between witches and mystics are striking. Both spoke the language of freedom, symbols, silence, and the body. Both dared to trust their own experiences instead of bowing to external authority. Both were attuned to the rhythms of nature and the dance of the stars. Both believed that the divine manifests not only in temples, but also in the damp earth. The flicker of a candle, deep breaths, contemplative ecstasy, and unity with the whole. And both faced persecution because their very existence challenged the power structures that sought to confine the sacred within rigid formulas and human institutions. The process of repression against these figures was not just physical, it was also symbolic. By linking mysticism with madness, magic with sin, femininity with deviance, the body with corruption, and freedom with threat, dogma wove an invisible web of control that has persisted for centuries and continues to this day. In many ways, we still live under the shadow of that past. Even now, a wise woman is labeled as esoteric, intuition is mocked as superstition, symbolic thinking is dismissed as irrational, and the personal quest for truth is met with skepticism from institutions. While the flames may have died down, censorship remains alive in new forms. The memory of these persecutions serves not only as a historical lesson, but also as a vivid reminder of the dangers posed by any system that claims to hold the exclusive truth. The story of witches and mystics is the story of humanity striving to remember itself, seeking to regain its balance, and trying to reclaim what has been lost. A direct connection to the mystery, the freedom to feel, and the courage to know for oneself. They embody not just victims of the past, but timeless archetypes of spiritual resistance that continue to thrive even amidst the ruins of fear. Rescuing these voices is an act of justice and healing. It's about retelling the story from a fresh perspective, where the condemned are recognized as visionaries and the forgotten are brought back into the light. It allows their words, their practices, and their experiences to inspire us once more, reminding us of a spirituality that doesn't seek permission, doesn't ask for approval, and doesn't submit. A spirituality that pulses in the earth's core, sings in the leaves of trees, vibrates in our dreams, and remains untamed, silent, and indestructible. Because as long as there are those who question, who seek, who feel, and who listen to their inner voice, the flame of those souls will never be extinguished. They are not merely memories of what once was. They are prophecies of what can be reborn. They are the seeds of freedom that always return. For no matter how much dogma tries to silence it, the spirit always finds a way to break free. And it is through this opening that we once again hear the whispers of witches and the songs of mystics, proclaiming that truth, when alive, can never be tamed. In the heart of an era where ecclesiastical dogma reigned as absolute truth, voices emerged not to destroy faith, but to expand the understanding of creation. These were individuals driven by a fervent passion for discovery, for the order of the cosmos, and for the harmony that underpins the heavens and the foundations of matter. Scientists, natural philosophers, mathematicians, astronomers, and thinkers who, by studying the movements of the stars or the structures of reality, dared to challenge the official narratives that had been declared immutable. These seekers were not at war with the divine, they were striving to comprehend its manifestations. Yet, as is often the case with any attempt to understand that falls outside the bounds of institutional authority, their inquiries were soon perceived as threats. And the price for their earnest pursuit of truth, as always, would be persecution, imprisonment, forced silence, and for some, death. In this context, the figure of Giordano Bruno stands out as one of the most tragic yet illuminating representations of intellectual freedom clashing with religious authoritarianism. Bruno was a philosopher, poet, cosmologist, and mystic. He was not satisfied with inherited ideas. Instead, he sought to understand the universe in a comprehensive way, blending science, spirituality, and metaphysics. He boldly asserted that the universe was infinite, that other inhabited worlds existed, and that God manifested in everything, an outlook deeply rooted in panentheism that threatened the separation between the creator and creation imposed by the theology of his time. His cosmology not only challenged the geocentric view, but also dismantled the notion of a closed, hierarchical universe centered on Earth and controlled by sacred intermediaries. For the Inquisition, Bruno's issues were not just scientific, they were fundamentally theological. His perspective undermined the monopoly on spiritual mediation. If the divine exists in everything, then no temple, authority, or doctrine can claim to be the sole guardian of the sacred. This is why he was prosecuted, accused of multiple heresies, imprisoned for 7 years, and ultimately sentenced to death. In 1600, Bruno was burned alive in Campo de' Fiori in Rome. They destroyed his body, but not his ideas. His vision of an open cosmos, a vibrant universe, and a boundless spirituality continues to resonate today as a cry for intellectual and spiritual freedom. His death was the price he paid for refusing to abandon his thoughts, and his courage remains a legacy that transcends the centuries. A few years later, another name would become synonymous with the clash between science and dogma: Galileo Galilei. An astronomer, physicist, and mathematician, Galileo improved the telescope and used it to observe Jupiter's moons, the phases of Venus, the irregularities of the moon, and countless other phenomena that directly contradicted the geocentric cosmology upheld by the Church. Drawing on the ideas of Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo championed the heliocentric model, which posited that the Earth orbits the Sun. This seemingly technical assertion was an ideological bombshell. It challenged humanity's central position in the cosmos, undermined the notion of Earth as the center of creation, and by extension, cast doubt on literal interpretations of the scriptures. The Church, which had already placed Copernicus's works on its list of forbidden books, saw Galileo as an even greater threat due to his influence, charisma, and rigorous scientific method. He was summoned to appear before the Inquisition. In 1633, after a lengthy trial, Galileo was forced to publicly recant his ideas, swearing that he would no longer support heliocentrism. Condemned to house arrest for the rest of his life, he spent his final years in isolation, under surveillance and censorship. The phrase "eppur si muove," and yet it moves, though historically uncertain, became a symbol of the resistance of thought against the tyranny of sanctioned ignorance. Science did not stop with Galileo. However, his public humiliation served as a warning to all who dared to place reason above submission. These episodes represent more than just a conflict between science and religion. They illustrate the clash between two paradigms: one that seeks to control the narrative of reality through a centralized authority, and another that relies on observation, experience, discovery, and the courage to question. Dogma thrives on the stability of thought, while science, much like true mysticism, flourishes in instability, doubt, and an unrelenting desire to push beyond boundaries. This is why Galileo and Bruno, despite their differences, occupy the same symbolic space. They were men who endeavored to expand the horizons of human consciousness, and in doing so, collided with the walls erected by fear. The violent response to scientific discoveries was driven not just by a defense of faith, but also by a fear of losing control over the collective imagination. Dogmatic cosmology was more than just an explanation of the universe. It was the foundation upon which the religious and social hierarchy rested. Claiming that the Earth revolves around the Sun undermined the very metaphysical basis of an entire power structure. This wasn't merely about astronomy, it was about spiritual geopolitics. A reconfiguration of the cosmos meant a reconfiguration of authority, and that was unacceptable for an institution whose stability relied on the immobility of ideas. It's important to remember that many scientists of the time did not see a contradiction between faith and science. The conflict wasn't between science and spirituality, but rather between freedom and control. Many great thinkers viewed their discoveries as manifestations of divine order. However, this integrative perspective was shattered by doctrinal rigidity. Instead of allowing faith to evolve alongside knowledge, it was frozen in time. This created an artificial chasm between science and spirituality, a divide we are still trying to bridge today. In doing so, we lost centuries of opportunities for integrating reason with intuition and logic with transcendence. What Galileo, Bruno, and so many others faced was the terror of static thinking in the face of change. They were condemned not for being wrong, but for shifting the tectonic plates of knowledge. Institutional inertia cannot tolerate movement. As a result, advancing knowledge will always be met with suspicion by those who thrive on stagnation. This dynamic is timeless. Wherever a new truth emerges, there will always be resistance from those who benefit from the old. Whenever a discovery points to an expansion of consciousness, forces will arise to silence, erase, or discredit it. The fear of the new does not stem from the essence of faith, but from the addiction to control. However, despite the persecutions, free thought has endured. Over time, ideas once condemned have become integral to the foundation of modern knowledge. Today, the heliocentric model is taught in schools. The vastness of the universe is celebrated in documentaries. Galileo's telescope is now a museum piece, and Bruno's vision of multiple worlds resonates with contemporary astrophysical theories. The inquisitors are long gone, but those who dared to see beyond remain. Because truth, even when suppressed, always finds a way to emerge. It may be denied for a time, but it can never be erased. The story of these men teaches us that thinking, in itself, is a revolutionary act. It shows that seeking the truth is a risk worth taking. Freedom isn't given, it's earned, often at a painful cost. Yet it also reminds us that every step toward knowledge is a step toward freedom. Each glance through the telescope is a victory over darkness, and the price of truth, no matter how steep, is always less than the cost of imposed ignorance. To live without questioning is to exist in captivity. The human spirit, by its very nature, was born to soar. Even though the bonfires have long since died out, the public displays of faith have vanished, and the inquisitorial courts have been disbanded, the logic that underpinned the dogma remains very much alive, adapted, disguised, and far more sophisticated. Control over thought no longer requires visible chains. Censorship doesn't need to announce itself as such. In the modern world, dogma operates in new forms. Technology, science, politics, economics, education, culture, and religion continue to be the arenas where truth is contested, shaped, and silenced. What was once proclaimed by ecclesiastical councils is now enforced by algorithms, social norms, and institutional narratives that pretend to be neutral. Today's heresy isn't about burning books. It's about questioning established truths, doubting manufactured consensus, and daring to think for oneself. The power structure that for centuries donned the cross and mitre now presents itself in suits, lab coats, uniforms, or robes. The discourse that once echoed from the pulpit is now spread across social media, panels, official reports, newspapers claiming impartiality, and universities that tout their freedom. Yet the mechanism remains unchanged: to create a singular truth sanctioned by a central authority, whether scientific, political, ideological, or spiritual, and to dismiss any questioning as a sign of ignorance, madness, or danger. The new heresy is called doubt, and the new heretics are those who dare to ask, what if it's not that way? What if there's another path? What if the truth doesn't fit within these confines? Modern society takes pride in its freedom of expression, yet this freedom is closely monitored. Information platforms, which are supposedly neutral, operate through invisible filters that dictate what can and cannot be shared. Algorithms determine which voices are amplified and which are silenced. Censorship has been outsourced, internalized, and even aestheticized. Today, silence is enforced not through brute force, but through delegitimization, ridicule, and emotional manipulation. Those who diverge from the dominant narrative are labeled as extremists, conspiracy theorists, reactionaries, or simply irrelevant. Dissent has been stripped of its meaning. Thus, once again, free thought is confined, not by stone walls, but by the barriers of public opinion. The spiritual realm hasn't escaped the new guise of dogma either. Contemporary religions continue to replicate hierarchical structures that stifle the freedom of inner exploration. Even alternative spiritual movements which claim to be liberating often end up establishing their own orthodoxies. They simply replace one set of dogmas with another, where gurus take the place of the old bishops and absolute truths are once again proclaimed, just with a fresh vocabulary. The same control, disguised as enlightenment. Instead of being a space for expansion, spirituality becomes yet another trap, where the fear of social or cosmic exclusion still dictates the steps of the seeker. In this context, heresy remains the authentic exercise of spiritual autonomy. In the scientific realm, while advancements are impressive, a prevailing orthodoxy still dictates what can be deemed valid knowledge. Alternative theories, particularly those that delve into fringe areas like consciousness, spirituality, quantum physics, and integrative medicine, are often dismissed outright for not fitting into traditional paradigms. Scientists who dare to explore these boundaries find themselves marginalized, facing funding cuts, or jeopardized careers. Science is celebrated when it aligns with the system, but when it challenges it, it is silenced. The modern inquisitor dons a white lab coat, wielding not a cross but a graph, a research paper, or a technical report. In politics, the homogenization of discourse is even more pronounced. The space for genuine debate has been replaced by a battleground of narratives where each side crafts its own version of reality and treats any dissent as a threat. Polarization is not a coincidence, it's a strategy. It divides, weakens, and allows power structures to persist while the populace becomes consumed by artificial conflicts. Questioning the foundations of this charade turns one into an enemy of the system, someone to be discredited. Thus, the modern heretic is not on the fringes. They are pushed there by those who wish to keep the center intact. And, as in the past, the punishment is not physical but social. Invisibility, cancel culture, unemployment, isolation, and stigmatization. The educational system, in turn, no longer fosters critical thinking, but rather conformity. Schools and universities, instead of broadening horizons, churn out soldiers for the job market and defenders of prevailing truths. A child's natural curiosity is gradually replaced by rote memorization, fear of assessment, and soulless competition. The free spirit of the learner is crushed under the weight of the need to please an invisible evaluator. Dogma has seeped into classrooms, presenting itself as mandatory curriculum. The new heresy is teaching students to think outside the box. Teachers who dare to encourage reflections that stray from the script are marginalized, and students who question are indoctrinated into a form of obedience disguised as civic duty. Even language has been hijacked by the new dogma. Words like freedom, science, truth, spirituality, and knowledge have been redefined, drained of their meaning, and turned into mere slogans. What appears to be pluralism is often just a repetition of formatted ideas. Diversity has become a product. Rebellion has been tamed and transformed into an aesthetic. The system has learned to feed on its own criticisms, absorbing, neutralizing, and repackaging them as innovation. Heresy, once an act of courage, has become a marketing accessory, yet true free thought remains dangerous because it cannot be controlled, capitalized on, or co-opted. In the information age, ignorance hasn't vanished. It has simply become more sophisticated. Now it's embedded in an overload of data, a tangle of narratives, and an inability to discern what truly matters. The new form of censorship is dispersion. Excess has turned into a strategy for concealment. The earnest seeker is buried beneath a sea of voices, gurus, experts, and algorithms, all vying for their attention. In this environment, the truth isn't hidden, it's diluted. And this dilution is as effective as any book burning. It leaves the spirit skeptical, disconnected, and numb. And a numb individual doesn't question, they merely consume. Even so, there are pockets of clarity. Spaces where thought still breathes, where doubt continues to blossom, where the quest has not been abandoned. People who, despite the pressure, keep asking questions, investigating, feeling, intuiting, and remembering. They are the heirs of ancient heretics, the mystics who were burned, the exiled philosophers, the forgotten visionaries. They understand that freedom has never been comfortable, that truth has never been safe, and that the journey to find oneself requires more than just courage. It demands a rebirth. Because living in this world without succumbing to the web of lies that upholds it is, today, the greatest act of spiritual rebellion. The modern dogma may not be visible, but it is very much real. It doesn't announce itself, yet it commands authority. It doesn't impose its will with swords, but rather with statistics, headlines, protocols, and likes. It doesn't burn bodies, but it extinguishes consciousness. And still, it fears the same things that its predecessors did: authentic thought, genuine connection, fertile silence, and the gaze that sees beyond the veil. Because these elements cannot be tamed, they cannot be labeled, they cannot be controlled, and for that reason, they represent the new heresy, and also the hope for a new world. After centuries of repression, manipulation, and silencing, the human spirit stands resilient, exhausted perhaps, but far from defeated. The chains of dogma have been forged in fire, sustained by fear, and refined over generations, yet they have never been able to extinguish the invisible flame that burns within each person. The yearning for transcendence, the thirst for truth, the pulse of the sacred that insists on manifesting despite all odds. It is in this quiet, intimate, and indestructible resistance that true spiritual freedom resides. A freedom that doesn't rely on temples, sacred texts, hierarchies, sanctioned rituals, or external truths. It is a freedom that emerges the moment an individual closes their eyes to the noise of the world and turns inward to their own sacred center, a place where no institution can ever reach. This journey of return isn't an escape from reality. It's a deep dive into the truth that lies beyond the surface. True spirituality has never been about imposed beliefs or mechanically repeated rituals. It has always been about experience, presence, and awareness. This experience cannot be taught, forced, or purchased. It arises when the seeker realizes that truth isn't found in the words they've been given, but in what unfolds when inner silence takes hold. An awakened consciousness is inherently revolutionary. It breaks down boundaries, dissolves masks, and disrupts systems built on ignorance. That's why it's feared, not by the wise, but by those who thrive on control. Throughout history, all authentic spiritual traditions have pointed to this inner freedom. From the teachings of Buddha to the path of the inner Christ, from the Upanishads to the words of Sufi mystics, from African oracles to the shamanic wisdom of the Americas, the essential message has always been the same. The divine resides within you. There is no distance between the sacred and the human, except for that which is created by beliefs that have taught us to rely on intermediaries. Spiritual awakening begins when that veil is torn away, and we realize that what we seek outside has always been present within, simply waiting for us to come home. This return isn't immediate or comfortable. It's a profound journey where all illusions must be acknowledged and released. The ego, used to defining itself through external identifications, puts up a fight. Fear, fueled by centuries of punishment for seeking freedom, tries to convince us that it's safer to stay in the prison of the familiar. Yet there's something stronger, more ancient, and more authentic, a call that resonates from the heart. This call is wordless, but is instantly recognized when heard. It doesn't come from outside, doesn't require validation, and doesn't seek approval. It's the sound of the soul remembering itself. And when this call is embraced, the true journey begins. Not one of belief, but one of being. A spiritually free person doesn't need to fight against the system. Their very existence is already a form of rebellion. They don't feel the need to convince anyone, understanding that everyone has their own timing. They don't impose their views, recognizing that truth is a personal journey. They respect all belief systems, but do not submit to any of them. They walk with humility and strength, knowing that their authority comes not from external sources, but from a deep connection to their own essence. They can participate in traditions, but never as a prisoner of them. They can listen to teachers, but will never relinquish their inner sovereignty. They can learn from books, yet they understand that true wisdom cannot be confined to the pages. Spiritual freedom is not about isolation or arrogance. It's about being fully present, experiencing clear love, and embodying awakened compassion. An awakened being doesn't reject the world. Instead, they transform it with their energy. They understand that collective change only happens when individuals heal. External structures crumble only when internal foundations are purified. They don't get intoxicated by promises of salvation, knowing that no one can save anyone else. They walk with their feet on the ground and their awareness expanded, integrating heaven and earth, matter and spirit, science and intuition. They no longer live in fear of heresy, having realized that the greatest heresy is betraying one's own soul. In this new era that is unfolding, amidst the collapse of old paradigms, crises of collective identity, and the exhaustion of established models, spiritual freedom stands as the only true revolution. It is quiet, yet irreversible. It doesn't seek applause or platforms. It flourishes in silence, through solitary meditations, mindful breaths, introspective walks, heartfelt tears, and courageous decisions. Once it takes root, it transforms everything. The external world may remain unchanged, but those who see with the eyes of the Spirit are no longer deceived by appearances. The veil has been torn, the illusion has fallen away, consciousness has awakened. This new human being isn't bound by titles, dogmas, or conventions. They appreciate the beauty of traditions but refuse to be confined by their walls. They honor the masters of the past while forging their own path. They understand that the sacred isn't owned, doesn't have a fixed form, and can't be reduced to mere symbols. Therefore, their spirituality is vibrant, breathing, and organic. They connect with the source anywhere, in a forest, in a temple, in a smile, in a poem, in silence. They know that the true altar is an awakened heart, and that the greatest prayer is living consciously, in alignment, and with integrity. Once this awareness is awakened, it cannot be erased. It can be challenged, ridiculed, or attacked, but it can never be destroyed. This awareness precedes fear, systems, and history. It is the very essence of being. It existed before any religion and will continue to exist long after they have faded away. Mystics have referred to it as the divine spark, Gnostics as inner light, Eastern traditions as full presence, and indigenous peoples as the spirit of the earth. Call it what you will, names don't matter. What truly matters is that it is alive and awakening in many, quietly yet powerfully. It is this awakening that truly threatens the structures of the old world. A spiritually free being cannot be manipulated, bought, or trained. They think for themselves, they feel for themselves, they choose for themselves. They do not succumb to guilt or the promise of reward. They live in the moment, not out of obligation. And because of this, they transform everything around them, not through speeches, but through their energy, not through imposition, but by example, not through fear, but through love. Because spiritual freedom is not an end, it is a beginning. It is the return to who we have always been, before the masks, the fears, and the walls. In this return, we discover not only ourselves, but also all those who walked before us, the burned mystics, the exiled alchemists, the silenced sages, the vilified witches, the forgotten visionaries. They were not defeated, they were merely sowing seeds in barren soil, seeds that now take root within us. Their heresy is the freedom that blooms today. The freedom we have won will serve as the foundation for those who come after us. Because truth never dies, it only transforms, and it always returns. Always. Mind Unfettered, the stage is yours now. Of everything we've explored so far, which part of this story resonated most deeply with you? Was it the courage of the mystics? The silence imposed by the structures? Or perhaps the spark of freedom that you know is awakening within you? Share your thoughts below. Your perspective is an integral part of this journey. When we share, we create together. Every word you leave here plants another seed of awareness in this collective awakening. Let's come together to manifest this spiritual freedom. And if you felt something stir within you today, just wait until you uncover what Jesus truly left behind as a hidden roadmap for the awakening of the soul. Watch the next video on your screen now. The Book of 33 Steps, the hidden map Jesus left for enlightenment. You're about to uncover something that has been hidden for centuries and is now finally coming to light. I'll see you there, seeker of the unfettered mind.